Okay, class. This week we're finally getting to the invasion of Western Europe. The U.S. and its allies are creating a second front, which Stalin had been demanding ever since the U.S. entered into the war. And when I say the U.S. and its allies, of course, I'm talking about England. That should go without saying. Canada was significant as well. Canadian troops fought bravely in World War II. In fact, Canadian troops ultimately liberated the Netherlands. Polish troops, French troops. Um, it was quite the United Nations was made up of many troops. So D-Day is probably something that many of you have heard of, but just to kind of remind you of how we got here. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and Great Britain decided on a Germany first strategy. That didn't mean that we weren't fighting the Japanese. We're fighting the Japanese all along. The U.S. Was the one nation in the world during World War II that could fight a two-front war and fight it very effectively. We ended up defeating both the Japanese and the Germans, of course. It's incredible. We shouldn't really take it for granted that the U.S. was able to fight a two-front war. So, but the focus was on Germany at the same time that we were fighting France. Germany was seen as ultimately the greater threat. And unlike in the Pacific, where the U.S. military had a pretty clear idea of how it wanted to defeat Japan, it had been game planning a war with Japan since the end of World War One. So there was a pretty clear game plan in the Pacific about the way to defeat Japan, which I'm not going to go into in this course. But as you know, in Europe, there were fights about the way to attack Germany. We've talked a lot about this in the course. The U.S. Top command, General Marshall especially, but basically all of the U.S. top command wanted to go for the jugular. They wanted to go right at Germany through northern France. And remember, what was the advantage of northern France? Well, it was terrain that was relatively flat, so it was terrain in which our tanks could move. So this was kind of the U.S. This is the U.S. thinking. Let's go for the jugular. Let's go at Germany through France. We need to get boots on the ground in France and go right into Germany. As you know, Churchill was opposed to this going for the jugular strategy of the U.S. Churchill was still haunted by the memories of World War One. He felt like what would happen in France would devolve into another trench warfare as it occurred during World War One, and he did everything he could to implement his so-called soft underbelly strategy, which was attacking Germany peripherally. I can't say the word peripheral this morning. Um, so this is why we get North Africa. This is why we get the Italian campaign. If Churchill had his way, he would have attacked Germany through Turkey, through the Balkans. It really would have been a disaster. So Churchill wins the early battles. Marshall wants to go at Germany. Really, if necessary, he would have attacked if he'd had his way. He would have attacked France as early as the autumn of 1942, especially if the Soviet Union seemed on the verge of collapse. Uh, Marshall supported this kind of mad dash into France as early as 1942. Didn't happen. The U.S. wasn't ready yet. We didn't have the landing ships necessary to put the boots on the ground. The U.S. Army, which had been pretty small before World War II, it really had to learn how to fight the war. And so Churchill proposed North Africa, as you know, and with Roosevelt's backing, U.S. troops, Allied troops invaded North Africa, especially U.S. troops. The British troops are already there. The Germans suffer a major defeat in North Africa. So Churchill was right to oppose the early landings, 1942, 1943 landings. North Africa was a good idea. It worked very, very well. But I just want to stress to you, this was Churchill's idea. This wasn't U.S. Military strategy coming into the war. We Roosevelt backed Churchill because, as I said before in class, we had to fight somewhere in 1942, and we weren't ready to fight in France. So North Africa campaign. Then what after North Africa? What did we do? We're into 1943 now. Well, as you know, the U.S. still wasn't ready to invade France. There was a massive buildup of manpower and supplies into England that was still occurring, but the landing craft are still being built. Also, even though the U.S. has a Europe first policy, the U.S. military does have to share landing craft with the military in the Pacific. And the military in the Pacific is landing on all kinds of islands in the Pacific, and they're demanding military craft as well. So there's only X amount of these landing craft to go around. So 1943, the U.S. and its allies still are not ready. The summer of 1943, and it has to be the summer of 1943 because in the winter, in the fall, and in the spring, the North Sea. The crossings from England into France are just too rough. It's impossible. So there's a narrow window in which you can invade France, and that stretches from about mid-May into maybe mid-September if you want to stretch it. So that window in 1943 was also closed as well. At Churchill's suggestion, or maybe even better word would be insistence. The U.S. and its allies, Great Britain, attacked Sicily and then into Italy, which we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. So that was the next step. But none of this was inevitable when Pearl Harbor happened. The U.S. It did have an overall strategy. It wanted to go right after Germany, but the way to do that wasn't quite clear. So Churchill was kind of behind the wheel. In 1942 and 1943, or to put it another way, the North Africa campaign and the Italian campaign. But by November of 1943, as I talked about last week, the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met at Tehran. And the U.S. and Great Britain were fighting like cats and dogs about what to do next. And they were basically at a stalemate. Churchill had dug in on this crazy soft underbelly plan of his, strategy, I guess, of his. The U.S. wanted to go for the jugular. And let me just say again, Churchill has he kind of covered up. That may be a little bit too strong a word, but he was able to kind of camouflage. Maybe that's a better word. After World War II, he was able to camouflage his opposition to the invasion of France because he survived World War II and he wrote a memoir of World War II. And in that memoir, he says, "Oh, of course, I supported the invasion of France all the way along the line." And a lot of people bought his story. He was very, very eloquent. And I would say it's only in the last, folks always knew, especially U.S. military. I mean, it wasn't like it was a big secret that Churchill had grave doubts, I guess is the best way you could put it, about the invasion of France. The information was there, but in the public memory, it just kind of gotten obfuscated. But in the last 20 years, some documentation has come to the fore. Also, historians are just taking a harder look at Churchill. And it's pretty clear he did everything he could to undermine Overlord. And he fought it until the last second, until basically he just had to go along with it. He just had to go along with it. He wasn't going to be so opposed to it that he was going to undermine it and try to make it a failure. But I think the best way to think about it is Churchill's dragged kicking and screaming into the invasion of France, which finally occurs in June of 1944. So at Tehran, what had happened, to circle back to that, you had the British and the Americans were at loggerheads, and Stalin had the final vote. And of course, Stalin was going to support the invasion of France. This is what he'd been wanting all along. So Stalin comes down very hard on the side of the United States, on the side of the invasion of France. And it's at Tehran. It's not until really November 1943, which is only, what, 8 or 9 months before D-Day, that the final decision to invade France is made. And the U.S. military gets what it had wanted all along, an invasion of France. Now, at Tehran, the decision was made to invade France in May of 1944, but for various reasons, including logistics and weather, the invasion doesn't happen for a couple of weeks later than was agreed upon at Tehran, just a few weeks. So it ultimately doesn't matter. The decision is made to invade France. Also, as I'll talk about next week, at Tehran, Stalin also agrees to attack the German army in the Soviet Union at about the same time that Overlord occurs. So this is often forgotten in the common memory of D-Day. But Germany faced attacks from both the Soviet Union and the Allies in June of 1944. Very, very serious attacks. So this is really the nightmare of the two-front war had come true for Hitler. But the Soviet operation has largely been forgotten, but you all are going to know about it because I'm going to talk about it next week. So again, just a thumbnail sketch of how we got here, the steps to Overlord, the surprising fights about whether or not to invade France, Churchill versus the U.S. military. But finally, by the spring of, but at Tehran in November late November, early December 1943, it's a go. The decision is made, and Churchill is forced to go along. And the planning and the incredible logistics that go into the invasion of France move full speed ahead for the June invasion of France. One more thing about Churchill, you may be tired of me talking about Churchill. I just think it's so surprising how much he opposed Overlord. He said, "Look, let's do it in 1945." He was kind of like a procrastinator. Who knows if it would have ever happened if he'd been in command? But luckily, he wasn't in command. Now, to give Churchill credit, though, he was right in 42. We weren't ready to invade France in 42. It would have been a disaster. 43 probably wouldn't have gone so well either. So Churchill was correct, especially in the North Africa campaign, which was hugely successful. Even Stalin supported the North Africa campaign. The Italian campaign, much tougher, although we did tie down a number of divisions of German troops throughout. So that's more arguable for sure. But after Italy, as I said in class the other day, Churchill is out of the driver's seat. And at Tehran, the U.S. military is firmly in the driver's seat. And Churchill pretty much becomes a junior partner in the war effort.